Last time, we looked at a survey of artists and styles concerned with exploring the limits of pure abstraction, and we used the term formalism to describe this goal. The trajectory towards this interest in pure form eventually led to styles like minimalism, which was looked at by some as a kind of endpoint or conclusion to this purely formal way of thinking about art. Of course, formalism wasn't the only goal of artists working at this time. There is another story of modern art at mid-century, a story about the artists who were still engaged with representational subject matter and themes reflecting the social and political conditions of the time. They were less concerned with art's continuing vitality through abstraction. For these artists, art making was foregrounded by the work's ideas, and the work's content was more reflective of their cultural landscape. By the early 1960s, certain critics suggested that purely formalist art might be too constricting for artists or viewers who didn't have the same interest in the language of pure form. Furthermore, critics said this work was too removed from the space of everyday life, meaning it was too abstract. There was nothing really to engage or sustain a viewer over a period of time. And from a certain perspective, we might say that all of this work began to sort of look alike. And another criticism of this work was that it was too academic, meaning that it was too invested in a proper way of making art or thinking about art. And that in fact, to get this work required some effort on the part of the viewer. One would have to learn about formal elements. One would have to take a class like this, per se, or learn about the artist's process to really appreciate the work. One of these critics was Marcel Duchamp, who had moved to New York in the early 1940s. He remarked that the trend in art towards pure abstraction was more an interest in a kind of retinal art. That is, a kind of art that is primarily for optical stimulation, visual pleasure, or purely about decoration and aesthetics. Duchamp and other critics began to be suspicious about some of the language that was emerging surrounding formal art that suggested that these works had intrinsic value by the virtue of their mere being, or that they possessed a kind of inherent meaning bestowed upon them by the artist through the act of making. Duchamp pointed out that in fact cultural context is what gave these works any meaning to begin with. First, we have to consider them through the lens of an art historical context. They wouldn't have a frame of reference without the abstract artists that came before. And the New York art world was another cultural frame within these works trafficked, which conferred on them a kind of status simply because they were being looked at and valued by renowned curators and collectors. And in terms of the relationship between context and actual location or site, think about the way an artwork feels more or less important based on the space where you see or encounter the work. The example here is on the left we have an image of the Rothko Chapel, which was a dedicated space built for the installation of a series of color field paintings by the artist Mark Rothko at the Menil Museum in Houston. And on the left is a screenshot of one of my favorite art sites called Great Art in Ugly Rooms, where the artist who runs this site takes famous works of art and photoshops them into these sort of really banal, strange contexts like, bedrooms or dorm rooms or laundromats or Walgreens or things like that. And to see them side by side, I would just sort of ask you to think about, does one feel more important than the other, or does one feel more official than the other? And this is essentially was Duchamp's point. He was saying that, abstract art, of course, is art, but to be considered important art in the way that it was in the 1950s and 60s, he said that it needed the atmosphere, it needed the environment, it needed the context to be placed in to confer upon it that sense of importance. And this isn't something that these works were sort of naturally inclined to be able to do on their own. Duchamp also noted that the viewer is another important contextual factor. And that in fact artists like Mark Rothko or Donald Judd or Jackson Pollock aren't the lone creators of their work. But it's really more of a collaboration between the artist and the viewer, because it's the viewer that respond to these things. It's the viewer that sort of give meaning to the work through the process of evaluating them or looking at them or trying to understand what it is that they're seeing. So then what would a kind of art look like that openly embraced cultural context and was a willing receptor for the culture in which it was living? And an art that acknowledged viewers and invited interpretation. At mid-century, it looked something like this. This is an infamous work by the artist Robert Rauschenberg titled Monogram. It's sort of like his urinal at this time in his career. It combines several media, hence the term combine, which he used to describe these sorts of things. It's part printmaking, part painting, and part assemblage art. Rauschenberg was associated with a mid-century resurgence in Dada called Neo-Dada. What about this speaks to you as Dada? Possibly its embrace of an anti-aesthetic, its experiments with found materials, and its criticism of the notion of value aligned with craft or authorship. You don't go looking at these things for an aesthetic experience, rather it's supposed to provoke acts of interpretation and deciphering. Like the Dadaists and the Surrealists, Rauschenberg liked to play with juxtaposition and elements of surprise. He often talked about working in the gap between art and life. He often said he was aiming for something other than what he could only make himself, so the objects were changed by their context and therefore became something totally new whenever they were shown in a different place or seen by a different person. The artist Jasper Johns was a close colleague and friend of Robert Rauschenberg's, and his work was more disciplined in terms of material. He often worked in the traditional oil paint medium or in encaustic, which is a process of painting with melted pigmented wax. Johns also used found subjects, but his interest was in images that were visual representations of other things, such as numbers, maps, or flags. John's work depends on our recognition of the given sign such that we get something in the work right away. I think of them as like visual carrots. They lead us into the work. But just like the carrot in the metaphor is about distracting us while we're led somewhere else, the question then becomes, where is he having us go? What happens when the subject matter is already an abstract concept, like a symbol? Can we still read the subject as a purely abstract image, or does the sort of representational associations of that symbol kind of overwhelm the experience of the thing? These are questions that Jasper John brought to several of his works, including his works dealing with the American flag image, where I think he poses some interesting challenges for the viewers, right? And sort of asks us if we can separate out the representational content of what we sort of know this thing to be or what we've learned this particular thing to be from its sort of purely abstract nature, right? At the same time, we're just looking at a flat field with stripes and stars. And so John's works are situated in this space between pure formal abstraction and imagery that's more obviously and transparently reliant on cultural context.